Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Into Wonder podcast. Today, I am very excited for this conversation. It is with an old professor of mine. His name is Dr. Adam Chin. He is a philosopher of science, and he's also a professor at MiraCosta at Oceanside. He received his PhD in the philosophy of science at the University of California, Irvine. And as I said before, he's an old professor I had, and that class has been so far one of my favorites in college. It was just ran in such a cool way. All the stuff he talked about, it was so exciting, and so much of it has like stuck with me to this day. The class I took with Professor Chin was a year ago. It was 2 semesters ago, and there's just so much stuff that I still think about all the time. Um, it was just such an awesome class, and I'm so excited to have this conversation and kind of go into a little bit more of these ideas that we talked about in class, and also a lot of what Professor Chin specializes in particular. So I'm very excited for this conversation. Also, Professor Chin loves salmon cookies and goats. He's a goat enthusiast. Professor Chin, thank you for coming on here and doing this with me.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a really big honor whenever I can reconnect with students, and it's so inspiring seeing you doing this kind of thing, exploring these different philosophical and other types of interests you have in this kind of manner. And I'm I'm very pleased that I had some kind of hand in that.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm so excited to do this. This is so fun. Um, so for myself and the viewers, just to like start with your background, you were originally pursuing STEM in academia, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
You
coming out of high school, I was very convinced that I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to study physics. I wanted to do nuclear engineering, find out ways to perfect nuclear fusion, and I was also really convinced that the humanities, philosophy, history, things like this were really stupid, and they were stupid at least in the sense of why would I ever waste my time in college and waste my money getting a degree in something that doesn't actually produce anything in the world, is not going to have like big impact on humanity, like, finding good energy solutions would. And so I went into college very anti-humanities. Back in the day, we had this term STEM lord. I don't know if folks still use this anymore, but these people that look down on non-STEM people and think, STEM is the only thing worth doing.
That's a thing, yes.
So I went in as, astrophysics major at UC San Diego, and started taking my math classes, my physics classes. But I also, partly because I kind of had to, I took a philosophy class. Um, it's actually an ancient Greek philosophy class, and it was interesting. It was fun. I still didn't think it would be worth my time to like major or something like that in philosophy. Again, why would I waste my money doing that? But then I did this thing where I started looking through all the different courses offered by UC San Diego. And of course, there's a lot of classes. There's like thousands of these. But I highly encourage anybody who's, in college or thinking about going to college to just look through all the different classes that might be offered, because there's always like really cool, interesting things, unexpected things that pop up. I discovered, for example, they had a class just about pirates, like a history class,
Whoa,
which I ended up taking just because that sounded cool.
that is
But
cool.
I also discovered that there's this class called philosophy of science, and I saw it. I was like, holy shit, what in the world could like that be? Like, what would a philosopher have to say that could contribute anything useful to the sciences? And then I also saw that at UCSD, they also had a class called philosophy of physics. So not just philosophy of science, but specifically a philosophy of physics class. So I said, hey, that's kind of interesting, and maybe I'll just check it out and see what it is. And I did that, and those classes just completely changed my life. What I realized was that the things I was really interested in physics, how just understanding the way the world works, those were questions that were also explored by philosophers, in particular by philosophers of science. And I found that some of the questions that I was really interested in were actually better addressed, or maybe only addressed, by those philosophers. And so the kind of key moment for me that shifted me to philosophy of physics rather than just physics itself was I was taking a class in E&M or electromagnetism, and in electromagnetism, you start dealing with fields, right? The electromagnetic field. And fields are kind of weird things. They're really different from all the things you experience in, your intro, your first kind of physics classes and mechanics where you're just dealing with like point particles or objects sliding down inclined planes. But a field is supposed to be spread out over all of space. And we describe it by describing its values at all positions in space. And for me, I was like, how do I like think about that kind of thing? Is it like this like jello stuff that we're like all swimming inside of? Or is the field just kind of like a useful notation for us thinking about like how things act at certain points in space? And sometimes, right, we talk about there being different fields interacting, but are there really different electromagnetic fields, or is there just one? And it's just useful to kind of decompose things in the same way we decompose, I don't know, an object's like motion into vectors in different directions. So I was thinking about these things, and I asked my professor, I was like, how should I think about fields? And he put his hand on my shoulder, and he's like, son, that's a philosophical question. And I was like, okay. And he's like, then the follow-up question was even better. He was like, do electrons exist? I was like, what in the world? Like, how is that relevant? Like, these are totally different questions. And so I was thinking about this, and then I took this philosophy of science class that was on space and time. And I found out, hey, there's these philosophers of physics, and they're really interested in exactly those types of questions. What are fields? How should we think about those types of things? And so that's kind of how I got drawn into philosophy and away from physics.
That's really interesting. So it's like rather than looking at the the phenomenon or the theory for whatever a particular thing is, you're saying how do we arrive even coming up with this thought to describe this particular thing, like the method for it and the understanding of how do we even come to think about what this is.
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. I think at the start, I was mostly just interested in, so we go through our physics classes, we learn, hey, there's like these crazy phenomena that happen in the world, and we're always interested in how do we explain them. And the explanations that are given to us come in the form of these theories, Newtonian mechanics or Maxwell's equations. And we learn these things and we say, hey, these provide good explanations for the phenomena we see, right? We can, describe how the circuits work. We can describe how the satellites orbit. We say because our theories are effective at describing those things mathematically, we have an explanation for those phenomena. So I was interested in those kinds of things. I was interested in making predictions, but then I was also really interested in just like the things that the sciences postulate, the things that kind of appear in our theories are sometimes really weird things. And I just want to know like how do I imagine them? How do I visualize them? But then once I did start thinking about those kinds of things, I kind of then went down this kind of rabbit hole that you've kind of referred to a little bit of, well, how do people ever come to think about those things? Again, something like a field is totally different from anything we experience in our day-to-day life. Of course, like point particles like we use in normal mechanics are also totally different from anything we experience in everyday life because point particles have no extension, right? We can't deal with things that don't have extension because that's just not the world we live in. But I don't know, it's easier to imagine, take a billiard ball, make it really, really, really small or something like that, than to take a billiard ball and make it comprise the entire universe. And so again, that's a really weird thing. And again, I started grappling with, well, how do we also come up with those ideas? How do people start trying to think in those types of ways? And I audited or sat in on a couple of history of science classes. And again, that also drew me drew me more into kind of the humanities side of things, although I was always interested in studying STEM.
Mm-hmm. That's really cool. It's kind of made me chuckle a bit when you were saying like, how do we visualize these ideas in physics? Because I remember that's the one thing me and my friends would always say when we were studying um, physics last semester. I took Newtonian mechanics, and we would just be like, how do we like we understand the math for this, but like what in the hell is actually like how do we like physically wrap our mind around this weird idea? Is this even real? Like are we just
Yeah.
studying this idea rigorously and it's like not even like objective to reality, which we'll get to in a little bit. These questions, but I think that's really funny that you said you were like looking at it in that way, and then started looking at it from the philosophical lens and historian lens, and kind of seeing how uh, we even come to look at this stuff. I think that's really really cool.
Yeah, and there's so much to explore in that kind of area. It's one of these things where, I mean, this is really the case with any area of investigation. You kind of open the can a little bit, and then there's more cans inside there. There's all this stuff that just comes spilling out. It gets deeper and
Mm-hmm.
deeper.
Oh yeah, just preparing for this conversation, I was just looking at so many different sources on the philosophy of science, and I was just like, wow, this is like just the methods for how we do science. It's a lot just deeper and intricate, and just the way we think about things. It's always like it just is like more fractal and more fractal. Like it's so fun that people think about this stuff. People like you that go into these areas. It's so cool. Um, so I guess to lay the ground now for where this conversation is going to go. And we're going to focus on this idea of like truth, like what is truth and how do we get to that? We have these things called science and philosophy, religion. There's all these different fields that try to arrive at this word truth, or maybe that's their goal. Maybe it's not. Um, what is science, Professor Chin?
What is science? Okay,
Yes.
so this is a big difficult question. Um, and I think there's many different ways we could approach answering this. I mean, and you ask different people, you'll get slightly different responses. I think, in the modern world in the 21st century, right, science is a huge, big part of our intellectual life. It's also just a big part of everyday society. When we think about science, we probably do think about it somehow in connection to, as you said, the truth, right? If we want to know why something is the way it is, or why, something, at least in the natural world, works the way it works, uh, our first thought is probably, well, we think to the scientists, or maybe we want to know something about the human body. We think to the doctors, but we also think like, well, the doctors are the people with scientific knowledge about the human body, blah blah blah. Right. So we do think that there's this tight connection between science and the truth. And this plays out in, you know, all kinds of areas. One way to think about it is like from the industrial point of view, right? If we didn't think that there was some type of connection between science and the truth, then big companies wouldn't be paying scientists to make their products. Because in order to have effective products, you need some type of connection to the truth, or at least some type of connection to the way the world is, right? And so science somehow has to deal with the way the world actually is. And one way then we can think about this like more broadly or more narrowly. One really, really broad kind of bland way of thinking about science is probably something that you would encounter, and maybe you have encountered in any of your science textbooks, maybe in middle school, high school, even in your college textbooks. You open it up, first chapter, what is science? So you just say, oh, it's the study of the natural world. Right? And I I think that's a um, somewhat acceptable idea of what science is. But of course, there's lots of ways of studying the natural world that maybe we aren't comfortable classifying as science. So here's one kind of trivial example, something like history. Usually we don't think of history as a science, at least not in the 21st century, right? You don't get a STEM degree. You don't get a bachelor's of science in history anymore. You get a bachelor of arts, something different. But of course, historians just study the natural world, right? They're studying what's happened on planet Earth. So they're studying a natural body. They're studying natural objects like people or economic systems, right? But somehow we don't think history is a science. Even something like literary analysis, right? They're studying natural objects. They're studying things like language. They're studying books. They're studying pieces of literature, the reception of those things. But we don't think of, again, literature as a science. That's like the classic, like non-science thing. Um, so maybe we can't just say science is the study of the natural world. Uh, Maybe what we mean is something more like, well, it's the study of the natural world in some particular way, right? And this is also probably what you encounter in that first chapter of your science textbook. Or maybe if you're studying psychology, you take a psychology class, especially in those textbooks, because psychologists want to really emphasize that they are doing science. And what they'll say is something like, there's this method that scientists use to learn things about the world, right? Anybody can study the natural world, but not any type of study of the natural world is science, right? So we might want to say something like, well, astrologers think that they're studying the natural world, right? They look at the planets and they say there's some type of influence between their position and people's personality. These are all natural claims, claims about natural things, but they're not using the right methods. There's the scientific method. And so you learned through a long period of education what the scientific method was, right? You make a hypothesis, or you start by making some observation about the world. Something happens, and you develop a question. Why the hell does that thing happen? You develop a hypothesis that provides a possible explanation for why that thing happens. You design some experiment to go out and test that hypothesis. You run the experiment, gather your results, and then you maybe modify your hypothesis because it doesn't quite explain the phenomena you're interested in. And there's kind of this feedback loop, and that's the scientific method, or so we say. And so many popular conceptions of what the scientific method, or of what science is, rely on this scientific method thing. But of course, even then, we go that direction, we still run into those same types of issues. If you think about how historians investigate the natural world or do history, they do exactly that kind of thing. They're interested in something. Why did the Roman Empire fall? And they make some hypothesis. Maybe there was economic instability, or maybe there was, I don't know, the rise of Christianity or something. They make this hypothesis, they figure out ways to test their hypothesis. If this was true, we should find this type of evidence at this point in time. There should be this kind of, archaeological stuff in these places. They go out, they look for that kind of stuff, and they find it or they don't, and they revise their hypothesis. Right? And so even if we're going the scientific method route, we're still saying maybe history is a science, but maybe we're not comfortable with that. Because again, that doesn't seem to line up with exactly what we think science is, at least in the 21st century. So I don't think we can just rely on method, at least if we want to exclude things like history and literature. And people, the idea, the exact definition of science is still kind of free floating. But I think one thing I would propose, my view on this, is when we talk about science, we just mean those set of methods that are concerned with studying the natural world, which have proven to be, at some particular point in time, kind of the best methods we have for investigating and understanding the natural world. Now, of course, history under this definition is still going to count. Maybe I'm going to be on the side of people who say, well, maybe history should be included under the sciences. I probably prefer to say something like, well, we should be of the view that it doesn't really matter whether history is a science or not. Science just happens to be those methods of figuring things out about the world work, that work the best. And this is probably going to mean that over time, we're going to have to kind of revise how we think about science. We're going to have to revise what kinds of things count as science and what kinds of things don't count as science. But in general, science is just going to refer to those things that we think work for understanding the world. And I think this conception of science lines up with how scientists think about what science is. It lines up with what mainstream scientists, when they talk about pseudoscientists, what the pseudoscientists think science is, right? It's a definition of science that kind of unites all these camps. And we can talk more about any of that too as we go.
Yes. Do you think there's dangers in acquiring so much merit to science that we give science this sort of this truth label almost? Like, do you think there's a problem with sort of just in kind of looking at everything else, pseudoscience or other claims, as kind of, oh, that's not science, so let's not give that any validity? Do you think there's a problem that we view science as this holy grail of methodology for trying to get to the truth?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. And I think I'll give this like classic philosopher's answer of like yes, but also no. So as I said, I think, right, science this term science just comes to, within some particular society, refer to those methods and maybe that body of knowledge too, which that society thinks is kind of the best methods for figuring out the way the world is, or it's the best knowledge we have of the world. So science is always somehow connected to the truth. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that or anything. This is just how we use this term. But the danger, I think a danger can emerge when we settle on one particular way of inquiry or one particular collection of theories or of facts as being the truth, or the one and only method, or the one and only collection of facts or of theories. Um, and the danger is that once we've identified those things as the truth, capital T, is we close ourselves off from investigation, from inquiry itself. And so, we've seen things like this happen kind of historically. So some particular scientific theory gets enshrined as the truth, capital T, something like the geocentric view of the universe, right? So the geocentric view says the Earth is at the center of the universe, right? People had all kinds of very fancy mathematical and empirical arguments for this view, right? It was established science for a very long time. And because it was established science, people had really good arguments for it. It got wrapped up in all these other different facets of society. And probably when we think about the geocentric universe today, in the 21st century, we heavily associate it with like religious views, right? The Catholic Church, right, thought that, the Earth has to be at the center of the universe. And we think of it as like a more religious belief, a religious dogma rather than a scientific idea. But people have been working for hundreds of years to understand how the way the universe worked, and they reached this conclusion that the Earth was at the center of the universe. And they have, again, many, many years of empirical evidence to back this up and in sophisticated mathematical uh, justifications for understanding how the planets orbit when you have the Earth at the center, right? So it's a piece of science. But the problematic thing was that because it was scientific or because it was conceived as the fruit of the science, it got kind of ossified as the one true thing. And so when folks came along and they said, hey, what if we thought about things in a different way? What if the Earth wasn't at the center? What if it was the sun that was at the center? And hey, look, I can make these different observations and it kind of seems to align with that. And I can come up with these mathematical theories that can explain why we see things the way we do, even if the sun is at the center and it's not the Earth. Uh, People came up with these things, but then there was opposition, at least from certain corners, because hey, we have people coming in and saying this thing that's really well established science is false, and how could we do that, right? How could we have these people that come along like Galileo or something, and they think they have these arguments against the non-motion, I guess, of the Earth, or the Earth also being at the center of the universe. Uh, we can't have people like this coming along and just saying things that are outright false, right? And of course, today we think Galileo is this like hero for standing up for heliocentrism, for offering these great empirical observations. In fact, if you like look at the arguments that he gives, you look at the evidence he's using, none of it is very good for arguing that the Earth is not at the center or for arguing that the sun is at the center. Galileo's knockdown argument for the motion of the Earth, so the idea that the Earth again is going to orbit around the sun, is that you can't explain the tides otherwise. And now, of course, people had thousands of years of observational data that the tides, the motion of the tides, is intimately tied to the phases of the moon. But Galileo dismisses all of that. He says, no, the only possible way for the tides to work as they do is if the Earth is moving around, and that's kind of what sloshes the water around. And he makes some predictions. He says in certain places in Spain, there should only be one tide per day if the Earth doesn't move. Um, uh, or sorry, if the Earth does move, there should only be one kind of one ebb and flow of the tides per day in Spain. And these people in Spain are like, look, dude, we've been like living here our whole life. There are always, two high tides per day. And Galileo is like, nah, it can't be. So Galileo's evidence, not super great. Okay. But in any case, uh, sorry, I've gotten a little sidetracked here.
No,
Uh,
this is great.
the idea is what happened, right, was uh, people like the Catholic Church, institutions like the Catholic Church, took the accepted science of the day, the geocentric theory of the universe, and they enshrined that as the truth. It got tied up with all kinds of different things for like theological claims. And so it became really, really hard then to reject the geocentric theory of the universe, right? Once a new theory came along. But ideally, what would have happened is new theory would have been proposed. People would have been open to this idea being out there. They would have investigated the idea, looked at the evidence for it, and assessed on the mere basis of the evidence whether one theory was better than the other. Right? Galileo, of course, thought he was doing this. Galileo's evidence was pretty shitty. People within the church also recognized this. But over time, what's happened, of course, was more and more evidence for heliocentrism came out, such that we had to reject the geocentric hypothesis. And so now we all believe, probably believe correctly, that it's the Earth that orbits the sun, not the other way around. But again, the lesson here was the real issue was the Catholic Church saw the established science of the day as capital T truth and refused, in some sense, to even entertain the idea of rejecting that central theory. And I think that that's something that always happens, right? In that, or in the sense that we often have this tendency to again take the claims of science, enshrine them as truth with a capital T, and kind of refuse to look elsewhere, to look at possible challenges to those ideas. Um, and one maybe especially recent case of something like this, or one kind of emergent area where we're seeing this type of thing is in medicine, where there's established Western medicine, which of course is great. It works very, very well. There's rigorous evidence for a lot of it. But then there's this other like mysterious thing, the like Eastern medicine or alternative medicine. A lot of it is absolute bullshit. But there are some methods and there are some treatments which maybe they work. They seem to have worked historically for a long time. And that what that indicates is maybe they're worth investigating. And I think what sometimes happens in, you know, among certain circles, and certainly among circles of which I run, is we have this tendency to say, well, Western medicine is the thing that works. There's these other weird things, non-Western medicine, non-scientific medicine, what we call non-scientific medicine. And because we give them that kind of like label, they're not worth investigating, right? Just stick with the science, we say, right? I believe in science. I trust in science. Don't trust these other things. And while I think it's true, like we should trust in science because that's where we've done a lot of work and we have evidence to support it. We shouldn't just let that label of science dictate the only things we think are worth investigating. Maybe we should take some of these other alternative treatments seriously and subject them to the same types of rigorous experimentation and research that we've subjected all these other kind of classically called Western treatments to. And I think so to kind of come back to your question about the dangers of tying science to truth, the danger is once we've ossified whatever we think the science is as the truth, we stop thinking about other things that might also be true or whose truth might actually undermine the things we think of as being true. Again, I don't want to say like I 100% would never say like don't go to a Western doctor or something like this, or only take homeopathic medicines. Most homeopathic treatments are absolute garbage. And when you look at the theories behind them, that there's absolutely no way they could possibly work. But what's really important is that we look at the treatments and we think about how they work and how they could possibly work, and we investigate that. What's dangerous is when we close off the possible investigation. So there's, let me say one more thing about the dangers of science and science being the truth. So that there's this kind of danger of, oh, maybe we're gonna like miss out on things, right? We've become so focused on just looking at the one thing that we're not looking for alternatives or anything else. But there's this other danger that emerges, which is when you have those proponents of homeopathy or the proponents of, uh, you have the anti-vax community, something like this, and they come along and they say, "Well, we don't trust these things." And what we saw during the pandemic was there is this very quick science, anti-science kind of division that emerged, where the pro-science people were the pro-vaccine people, and somehow the anti-science people were the anti-vaccine people. Now, we did this partly because, well, the vaccines are supported by all the best science that we have. So it seems somewhat natural to do this. We also did this because we thought, and we still think, and we probably think rightly, that science is super valuable. And so we have the good people, and then we have who are in support of science, which is the universal good, and then we have the bad people, the anti-vaxxers who don't support science, and right that therefore they're bad, right? And this made the narrative really simple, but it also made the social situation really difficult to deal with because we polarized everything. The anti-vaxxers are just anti-science, the anti-good things, which indicates kind of that they're not reasonable people, and which indicates that they're not really people we can deal with, right? The way to deal with them is to shut them out, to exclude them, right? If they're anti-science, they're kind of anti-reason, they're anti-truth. And so what's even the point of trying to engage with them and trying to understand where they're coming from? But if we really wanted to address the problem of these anti-vaccine campaigns or these groups, then presumably we should go in and we should understand what their arguments are instead of just dismissing them as anti-science, anti-good things. What's even more interesting is that when you go to the anti-vax communities, no one's going to say they're anti-science, right? No one wants to say that they are anti-science because science is recognized as this universal epistemic good. Everybody wants to be on the side of science. Pretty much, of course, there's like some like weird outlier cases, but most people want to be on the side of science, right? What the anti-vaxxers will say is the science doesn't show that the vaccines are effective. Or they'll say things like, I've run my own experiments, I've done my own science, I've done my own research, and I have found that vaccines don't work for my children. Blah, 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 right? These are the types of things they'll say, right? They're not anti-science, right? They just have a different view of the science in some sense. What that indicates is that the right way to deal with the anti-vax community is to not just shout them out and say, you're anti-science, but to go into the community, think about what their issue is with the science that's out there, think about what kinds of concerns they have, and maybe try to educate them or something like this, engage with them on their own terms to try to show them like, here's the evidence, here's how it compares with the evidence you're bringing up, and here's why we think that the evidence in support of vaccines is superior to the evidence that you have, right? Maybe, for example, they have a misconception of how evidence in the sciences works. For example, evidence in the sciences standardly doesn't just rely on personal observation. It doesn't just rely on one homeopath's recognition that, hey, this treatment worked for, a lot of people that, I have seen, right? It relies instead on something like a randomized control trial where the practitioner doesn't even know what they're giving is the actual vaccine or is just like sugar water or something else. And, you know, it's a process that's supposed to guard against bias. Um, and it's, again, very different from just relying on personal experience. And so, again, I think going into those communities with that kind of approach of, hey, let's just understand what they're up to, instead of just labeling them as anti-science, is it's going to be much more effective if what we care about is getting people vaccinated.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, tying that
Something,
all back to the truth thing, right? The issue is,
yes,
as we equate science with truth, we are quick to make these kinds of divisions.
yes. There's so many things that came to my mind when you were talking about that. One of them to kind of add more to what you were just saying is that during that time period, 2020, um, the vaccines, I was not, like you said, I wasn't anti-science, but I would just hear so much about people that weren't scientists saying, "Oh, it gives you autism or it gives you cardiovascular issues or it messes up your neurochemistry." And so I never took the vaccine because I was like, "What? Why are there so many people talking about this? What the hell?" Like I was like, "This is." It just kind of like scared me, and I was uneducated. Like I just didn't. I didn't have the capability at the time to think things for myself and go to the source and see how I really feel about it. Um, but I think that that's a whole other like we could go down that, and that's actually something we talked about in class, which was really cool. The way that information can spread and now it can just all these groups of people can just That's kind of like with climate change. You have all these people that aren't scientists, that aren't biologists or chemists. They're politicians, and they're talking about that climate change isn't real and this and that. And it's like, do you even know like what? Do you even know like anything about chemistry or biology? And you're just making these claims because it's like there's nothing really backing it. Um, so yeah, I think that's where I stand with that. Was there something you were going to add?
Well, one thing I was going to say is like, yes, I think we can look back and we can say, hey, like I made this kind of epistemic mistake. Like maybe I should have gotten the vaccine. Maybe I feel like I got too swayed by all this other information that was around me. But there's also this sense in which like there was this flood of what we now recognize as misinformation, of all these people saying vaccines cause autism, right? And my baby died after getting the vaccine and all these things. And it's reasonable when you hear all of this information coming in to step back and be like, hold on, if all these people are having this experience, then maybe I don't want to engage in this practice. Maybe I don't want to get the vaccine, right? That's a natural and that's a reasonable way to respond, because that's how we come by pretty much all of our knowledge, is we look at what other people are saying, we look at what kind of the majority of people are saying, because we probably think, well, the majority of people like can't always be getting it wrong, right? But because we have these kinds of psychological tendencies to do this, to be kind of trusting of these other people, what we have to realize is that other people can come along and kind of take advantage of that. Maybe they do it intentionally, right? That's how all advertising works. Or maybe they do it in some sense accidentally, because the systems of how we get information nowadays are set up in a way that make it really easy for us to get this type of misinformation. And so, of course, I am thinking about the way we get our information now is we're scrolling, we're on social media, right? In social media, most of it doesn't differentiate between like the experts who spend their life studying this stuff and just the randos who are just posting whatever shit they want,
Mm-hmm.
right? And because again, we're kind of psychologically evolutionary predisposed to just kind of be relatively trusting and to trust in kind of group thinking. An algorithm is feeding us all this stuff, right? We're going to be predisposed to accept that stuff. And so, you know, yeah, maybe you should have gotten the vaccine, right? But also, I think the lesson to take from this is to think about the way in which we get our information and the ways in which those channels of information can misinform us. And just having that more kind of critical perspective, I think, is really valuable. So all that was just don't be too hard on yourself, Antonio. Like
Yeah,
go out and get the vaccines now. But
thank
yeah.
you. I will say that even now, I try to avoid medicine as much as I can, which is going to sound ironic because I'm in school and I'm thinking about going into medicine and practicing. I think that's a possibility. But I still feel like um, this is just a personal belief, but I like just letting my body deal with things naturally. I mean, I wouldn't be alive if there wasn't Western medicine. I would have passed away a few years ago because of something I went through. But there are there are definitely, and we're going to touch on this more too, this idea of truth. Like, how do we actually know that these vaccines for 100% precision were not causing autism, maybe in one person or maybe in five people, or maybe they were causing cardiovascular issues, but it was on to such a small degree because, well, like, that's the field of biochemistry and medicine and pharmaceuticals, and they observe the behavior of these of they look at the cellular reactions, and they look at the proteins and the way everything interacts, and um, surely they can base their theories off of what they observe and what happens, but do they really know what's going on precisely? Like when I take Tylenol, do we know for certain that, okay, my headache's going away, awesome, but like what is really happening? We observe this, the pain receptors become repressed, like we can see some things going on, but it's like, do we know for 100% certainty um, where uh, what is actually going on? And I don't. My view is I don't think we do. I think we make very very good, highly sufficient theories, and I think that um, it's awesome that we have medicine and that we can help people in these ways. But I think that little gap where it's like we don't really exactly know what's going on leaves leaves that door open for possibilities for people to make claims like, oh, it caused autism in my child, or it's the reason my dad got a heart attack, or it's the reason that Bronny James, LeBron's son, had a cardiac arrest by playing basketball. Um, so yeah, I just think because that little door's open, that there is people can make claims and say things because what is the truth about medicine? Is it exactly fixing everything you say? Is it more mysterious than we think?
Yeah, I think actually this gets at maybe another one of these dangers that we had talked before of thinking of science as just the truth, full stop, right? Science is a process, right? And it's this process of figuring things out, figuring out how the world works.
Mm-hmm.
And what the danger is when we think that the process is completely finished and that we know for 100% this is exactly how the vaccine works, right? There's absolutely no doubt, right? But of course, right, and now, I'm not a scientist, so I don't know the details here, but right, presumably everybody recognizes like we don't know 100% sure exactly how the vaccines work in the sense that, look, the human body is really complicated. There's lots of junk going on in there. We know that we're putting in a certain set of chemicals, and we know that those chemicals interact in particular ways with certain subsystems of the human body. But there's so much shit going on, of course we like can't know absolutely everything that's going on in that system. But what we can look at is we can look at kind of statistical population level data of the effects that these chemicals we're putting into people have on those individuals. And we can look at how often people do or don't have the kind of outcomes we're interested in, namely not developing COVID or developing COVID. And we can make predictions on the basis of that. That, of course, aren't going to be 100%. There's always, the error bars, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at some point, right, and that's okay. That there are error bars is okay in science because science is not the truth. It is our way of finding out the truth. And of course, we can always go wrong, right? But we want to go the best we can. And with something like, personal health, right, the advisories that are given to us by, the doctors, by the government, these are things that work for most people, for a lot of people. And there's lots of evidence, usually, hopefully, behind these things that they're recommending, that these treatments do work for lots of people, for the majority of people. But yes, there are some cases where it doesn't work for those for some people. But it would never be the rational thing to do to say, if you don't already know that you have certain underlying conditions, to say, maybe I'm part of that 0.1%. Maybe I'm point of that 0.1%. Right? Because why are you special? Right? What evidence do you have that you deviate so much from the norm that you would fall into this very minute percentage of people? Right? There might be you very well might for other reasons. And maybe some people do have really good evidence for that, right? Maybe you're immunocompromised or you have, again, these underlying conditions. But for the majority of us, for the majority of people that are kind of in these alternative medicine or anti-vax camps, they don't fall into that position. And so from that perspective, it's not really rational to think that, right? Maybe another way of pointing of thinking about the vaccine and the medicine kind of stuff too is maybe you're taking like a math class, right? Um, and you're trying to solve a problem, or we can think like really basic. We're in elementary school, right? We're trying to like learn addition, or we're trying to learn something more complicated, like multiplication or something, or division. And the teachers give us different ways of thinking about how to multiply, right? Maybe you should think about it as like you're just adding things a bunch of times, or I don't know. Nowadays, you like look at yeah, it seems every 5 years or something, there's like a different way to teach a multiplication or something. There's a different way to visualize it. Um, and those different ways work for some people and they really don't work for other people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Again, this is the classic thing. Like if I look at an elementary school textbook now, I'm like, how in the world does this like method of division work? Like it makes no sense to me, but it makes
Mm-hmm.
sense for some people. But just because it doesn't make sense to me, but it makes sense for other people and it works for those other people, I shouldn't then conclude, oh, division just doesn't work for me. or something like
Mhm.
this, or conclude that that method of doing division doesn't work and wouldn't work for me,
To
right?
presuppose it without evidence that it.
Right, or even I have this some amount of evidence that like, oh, it didn't work in this case, it didn't work for me. I shouldn't then say this method never works,
Hmm.
right? Even if we do find one case or something where the vaccine has a bad consequence, right? Or you look at your Tylenol, right? Tylenol has had lots of bad consequences. That's why there's all the big list of side effects, right? I shouldn't again look at the list of side effects and say, oh shit, Tylenol doesn't work, right?
Mhm.
I should say, okay, yes, there's these side effects. Maybe it doesn't work for everybody, right? Maybe this method of division didn't work for me, but it worked for a whole lot of people. That's why it's in the math textbook. Hopefully, that's why it's in the math textbook. It's not because ed tech companies got a hold of people, paid lots of money. Um, so, in any case,
Yes.
yes.
Yeah. 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 It's a weird. It's kind of a weird area to. You shouldn't presuppose it towards everything. You shouldn't. Like, it made me think of breast cancer in this molecule called Taxol that I think comes from tree bark. Um, and my uncle, he was telling me about this. He's a chemist. That most of the time that molecule has a very good I don't know what they would call it, trajectory, or there's a high success rate for curing breast cancer, but for some people it just doesn't work at all, which is really weird. um, so there are just it's weird. It's weird when for some people Tylenol works and it doesn't, or some people different treatments work and for others it doesn't. um, yeah, that was just I just wanted to add on to what you said. Something you said earlier that's been like floating around in my mind that I really want to talk about is we're talking about Galileo. And we're talking about the church and how was it the Catholic Church that was had that belief that the Earth was in the center and okay, so
Yeah,
something that I heard the other day by Steve Fuller in that podcast you sent me. He said that a lot of these figures like Newton and Galileo, Copernicus and Descartes, that they were all religious, but that they all sort of felt like the church was inhibiting them in a particular way, and for them to express the way that they felt about the universe or their beliefs about things that occurred in the universe. Um, and for example, Isaac Newton is one of those figures where when we think of him, we only think of the work he did in physics, and something that we talked about in philosophy class and also the other day is that a lot of Newton's work on theology and the occult, which was the majority of the work he did, was all suppressed because the church didn't want uh, people to know about his heretical views. So I'm curious, um, what are your thoughts on the way that religion has played a role in um, inhibiting thought? It kind of reminds me of like Kuhn's paradigm. Like anything outside of that, it's kind of like the thinking the Earth orbits the sun. It's like whoa, that's don't think that. Like that's preposterous. Um, yeah, what is your opinion on the role of churches inhibiting free inquiry?
yeah. So this is a great question. In some sense, this has kind of been at the heart of much of my research. So as I went through grad school, my research program kind of developed towards just thinking about the relationship between religion and science, and how different people talk about that. So I have lots to say on this. Maybe a couple of
Yes.
things just to clarify some things you had mentioned. In the case of Isaac Newton, as you said, the majority of his written work was actually focused not on what he would have called natural philosophy, or what we today call science, things like his Principia Mathematica or his optics, but instead much of his written work was on, as you said, kind of theological stuff. He was had a lot to say about prophecy, and he had also a lot to say about biblical chronology, and he thought that kind of dark actors, evil actors, had gone in and changed a lot of things in the Bible, and he had all this work to apparently show this.
Mm-hmm.
And he also worked a lot on alchemical ideas, so trying to transmute base metals into gold and things like this. Um,
Searching for
but
the philosopher's stone too. I saw
yes,
something like
searching
that.
for the philosopher's stone, yeah. But you had mentioned that this was kind of repressed by the church, and that's not quite right. So to kind of clarify something, so um, Newton lived in England, and at the time England was not Catholic, was no longer a Catholic country, so it wasn't under the auspices of the church as we talk about the Catholic Church. Of course, England has like the its own national church. It has the Anglican Church, which in many ways is similar to Catholicism, though we won't go into this. Um, um, but Newton's it wasn't that the church was like aware per se of Newton's kind of weird
Well,
views.
Newton didn't want to show any of that. Like he didn't want to publish it because he knew it was heretical,
Y-
and he would be
yes.
the church would. I don't know how they would have reacted to that, but it would have been.
Right. Well, so uh as it were, um where Newton worked, like many universities at the time, right, receives kind of money and government uh, receive money and support from the government. And of course, in a place like England, where you have a state church, the Anglican Church, that's tied to the government, um, they could place certain kind of restrictions on who could teach at a university, and especially um, at a place like Trinity College, where Newton was, which by its name, Trinity College,
That's
it's a
funny.
religious school, right? Most universities emerged as kind of places to train uh, pastors or priests or theologians, right? And so, for a very long time, uh, universities always did have this kind of religious basis. And so, oftentimes, and in Newton's time, there were kind of um, doctrinal requirements that you had to express belief in a certain set of doctrines in order to qualify as a faculty member. One of these for Newton's school was belief in the Trinity. I mean, you're at Trinity College. You gotta believe in the Trinity. So you had to believe that God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit are at the same time distinct things and also one person, right? Newton privately thought this whole idea was utter balderdash, right? He could not believe that the Trinity was true. In certain of his writing, he says that the idea of the Trinity is like the worst thing that could have happened uh, to Christian religion. He thinks it's this abominable doctrine. Anyway, so if Newton came out and was like, "Yeah, I don't buy this," right? He couldn't have his position. Now, you know, some people, in the university kind of like knew Newton was, kind of had weird views. I mean, Newton was weird in other ways too, but they kind of like knew he didn't have these things. And so, Newton didn't actually have to publicly like assent to this. They like made some exceptions. So he could still teach, but all of his friends, he shared some of his theological writings with some of his close friends, and his friends were all like, "Yeah, you probably shouldn't. You probably shouldn't like publish this stuff because it's just not going to be good." And so Newton listened and didn't do it. But that's slightly different from a church coming down and being like, "Hey, like this is bad. You shouldn't do this," which is more similar to the case for Galileo, where uh, Galileo's work was kind of explicitly censored. So it was out there and then it was censored and kind of had to be withdrawn. Although the Galileo affair itself is very complicated and it's not this simple story of, uh, you know, the church suppressing good scientific thinking, which I guess can bring us to your original question, which was like um, how historically at least have like churches played into, I think as you put it, like the repression of scientific knowledge or how it comes out.
Hmm.
And the historical consensus, so people have thought about this for a very long time. And at this point in the 21st century, the historical consensus is that uh, churches, religion in general, have not really played a repressive role for science or in terms of scientific investigation. If anything, they've provided a lot of support for it. So here's kind of one way to think about the picture. if you think about something like the scientific revolution, all the science happening kind of before that, leading up into it, and the science happening kind of just after that, uh, who's funding it? Why are people doing any of the sciencey stuff related to astronomy or to the stars, right? Why do we care about the positions of the stars? And, and the answer, at least at the time, was people cared about it because they want to make predictions to keep time. You want to make predictions about when Easter is going to be, in particular, when Christmas is going to be. Well, mostly people care about Easter and knowing when Easter was going to be, so you can, arrange society to celebrate these things. And so tons and tons of funding, like all of the funding for astronomy, is being provided by religious groups, by the church, so that they can have calendar reforms, so they can reliably predict when the holidays are going to be, right? And so monetarily, there's like all the support is coming from the churches. And in terms of, motivationally, right, that's the push. This is why people are doing astronomy. Now, of course, on the ground, astronomers themselves, maybe they're interested in, figuring out when Easter is going to be, but probably not, right? Individual astronomers, they're just interested in the stars for whatever reason it is. They're interested in doing math, blah, 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 right? But again, if we look at it kind of large scale, churches are providing the majority of all the funding and providing motivation for doing these scientific projects in much the same way as the government today, at least in the US and throughout Europe and Asia, everywhere now. It's the government usually that provides the majority of the funding and in some sense provides the motivation for the science that we do, right? For example, in the US, we have like the NIH, right? There's a bunch of the National Institutes of Health. So there's a bunch of different particular institutes. There's over 20, I can't remember the exact number, but they're all focused on different kind of areas of disease. They have a goal. They want to say, beat cancer or beat certain forms of cancer. And so they put up tons of money for that purpose. They provide the motivation. We want to reduce cancer incidence. Why? Well, because it'll be good for the U.S. economy, it'll be good for the U.S. people, blah blah blah, right? And they're providing the means to do it. They provide lots and lots of money. But then you have individual cancer biologists. Why are they studying cancer? Maybe it is they really do care about saving lives and things like that. But of course, maybe others are just like interested in cells and they're interested in molecular biology, and the government happens to provide funding for doing these things they love. Okay, so sorry, coming back to early modern-ish period, and kind of churches repressing science, there is this sense, right? We look at the Galileo case and we're like, isn't that what's happening here, right? Galileo had these new ideas and the church is squashing it. And there is some sense in which that's true. Again, as we said, the church took geocentrism as kind of the truth and they incorporated it into its doctrine. It said, look, the Bible says certain things, right? Scripture says certain things that indicate or that are closely aligned with the geocentric hypothesis, right? In the book of Joshua, Joshua commands that the sun stands still, the sun stands still so that Joshua can finish the battle, right? That's a clear indication. They say that, look, it's the sun that orbits the earth, not the other way around, right? And what the church can say is, look, the best science of our day shows that that's true, right? So there's this nice relationship between the scripture and the science, right? But notice that the theologians are going to say it's like they're also going to care about the science stuff, right? They can point to the evidence from the astronomers, right? And to the evidence of the scripture and show, look, they've aligned, right? And when we think about what happened with Galileo's case, so Galileo again comes along, proposes the heliocentric view, and in 1616 he gets this kind of um, reprimand from the Catholic Church, from the Inquisition, saying you shouldn't teach these things as truth. You can teach them as a hypothesis, as one way of thinking about the world, but you shouldn't teach them as truth. Um, and Galileo says, "Oh, okay, whatever." 16 years later, political situation has slightly changed. One of his good friends has become the Pope, and he's now Galileo is like very close to many people who have high positions in the church, so not just the Pope, but like inquisitors. Um, he's had private communications with people again like the Pope, and the Pope's like, yeah, if you want to publish something again on heliocentrism, I might be fine. We'll probably do that. So Galileo says, great, I'll write up this thing where I compare geocentrism to heliocentrism and argue for the truth of heliocentrism. He publishes it. It's this two dialogues, or sorry, it hasn't yet published it. It goes to the Inquisition to make sure it's okay to be published. People in general are happy. The Pope looks at it and says, "Yeah, I'm happy with this, but I want you to add in this argument of mine at the end, and I want you to acknowledge that it's an argument that's out there in favor of the geocentric position, even if you're going to say heliocentrism is ultimately better, like you should at least acknowledge this other argument." Galileo says, fine. So he does this. It comes out. People start reading it. Now, if you read this book, and it's the dialogue concerning two world systems, what you'll find is that the person that gives the Pope's argument is called Simplicio, which means simpleton or idiot. And he's the person that supports the geocentric view of the world. And so, of course, Galileo puts out this book. The Pope sees that he is being labeled like this idiot. And of course, Pope ain't happy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, so there's like this kind of dumb political blunder by Galileo of like, you probably shouldn't do this to the most powerful person in your kind of local world. Um, but it's not just personal insult. The Pope is also worried about kind of the respect people have for the Catholic Church as an institution, because this is at a time of like the Counter Reformation. There's all these wars of religion going on. Protestantism is kind of emerging as the big new form of Christianity, and so there's all this vying for power and for respect. And so Galileo publishes this thing kind of at the wrong time in the wrong way. And so his book kind of gets retracted. He gets kind of condemned by the Catholic Church. He doesn't go to jail per se. He doesn't get tortured. There's this popular picture that he gets tortured, things like this. That's not exactly what happens. He gets imprisoned. He gets put under house arrest in a pretty fancy villa of one of his close friends. Um, and again, his book is retracted, um, but of course it still manages to get out of Italy. It gets published elsewhere, and Galileo eventually is able to publish some of his other work again outside of Italy. Okay, I give this story for to see some of the like social dynamics going on, but in
Mm-hmm.
terms of like repression of the scientific ideas, uh, many of the people involved in the inquisitorial kind of trials that Galileo went through were themselves astronomers. And they themselves uh, advocated, at least in their personal writings, kind of non-standard cosmologies. So cosmologies in which maybe the Earth was at the center of the universe, but everything else orbited around the sun, right? Or maybe they were open to the Earth not being at the center of the universe, right? Maybe slightly displaced, maybe something else, right? And there were people that were actively working on these things. But again, there was the sense in which maybe they shouldn't propose these things as the truth. They're merely kind of hypotheses, ways the world could be. Because again, what had happened was science was equated with the truth, right? And the truth, of course, can't change. There's only one truth. There's only one way the world is. And if scripture is also truth, and scripture and science are aligned in terms of what the truth is, then we can't change that, right? The mistake that was made was they tied the truth, the universal truth, to something, to a changing process, to science, right? Which always changes.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not that I don't think the right analysis of the situation with Galileo is that it's like the church and it's something just about the church as an institution or churches as institutions that repress the scientific thought. It's that connection, this false connection between science as it is at a moment in time and the truth as it always is at all times, right? We can't make that equivalence.
Have there been moments in history where it does seem like a particular religious institution was uncomfortable by certain beliefs? Someone that comes to mind is I think of Spinoza, who his views were very heretical, and he did kind of have a different idea of what God is. Like the God is sort of everything in the universe collectively, and how he was excommunicated from the town he lived in and stuff like that. Are there situations like that that are clearly sort of unethical and where there is sort of a institution standing up and saying this isn't allowed, this view, this theory, that inhibits again the idea of like free inquiry and being able to like think something that is different from what the church believes.
Yeah. So you can definitely find cases like this, and so sometimes when you read recent historical literature on exactly this, on religion and science in the relationship, sometimes you will find people making these big claims like religion and science have never been in conflict, or there has never been a case where a scientist was condemned, or their work was suppressed because of a religious institution or something like that. That's definitely not the case. But you can find particular instances like this. Another case maybe is something like Giordano Bruno. He's also a kind of a he's a natural philosopher. He's an astronomer. He was burned at the stake for some of his scientific beliefs. But it's also complicated because he also didn't believe. I think he didn't believe in the divinity of Christ either. But
Mm-hmm.
he was an early proponent of there being other worlds with like other life forms on them, and things like this.
Wow.
But you can find cases like this. But I also want to point out that you can find secular cases of this as well, where people are kind of pushed out for something like the the way they do science, or the way they conceive of science, or they're kind of forced to do science in a particular way. So one classic case that many people talk about is the Soviet Union in the case of Lysenko's biology. So Lysenko was this biologist. He was put in charge of figuring out how to, kind of make crops grow well, because the Soviet Union is facing, large scale famine. And he adopts some ideas, some from Darwin, because of course Darwin's like the foundation for all modern biology. And a central feature of Darwinian evolutionary biology is this notion of competition. But of course, this notion of competition is somehow at odds with communist ideology, right? In which we want to think instead about cooperation. And so Lysenkian biology somehow kind of dispensed with notions of competition, and instead substituted in kind of mere cooperation. I'm not going to go into any of the details of how this works, but ultimately what happened was Lysenkian biology didn't work out, didn't result in kind of these miracles of growing new crops that the Soviet Union wanted to. And historians' analysis of the situation is that this was directly related to the government's enforcement of a particular ideology of how to do science, right? Um, and we have other cases like this. So when relativity theory came out, right? Relativity theory, of course, comes from, or is most traditionally associated with somebody like Einstein. Of course, Einstein was building on the works of many others. But when it came out, one label for relativity science was Jewish science. And there were many people in the US, in Germany, and throughout Europe who kind of refused to accept relativity, not just because it's really difficult conceptually and it's really difficult mathematically to understand, but refused it on the grounds that it is Jewish science. Right? Now, again, that wasn't like theological beliefs, right? It wasn't there like, oh, look into the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is saying, hey, don't trust Jewish science, right? This was
Right.
this was more kind of Judaism is an interesting case of ethno-religiosity, but people's opposition wasn't referencing scripture or their religious beliefs or something. It was just, oh, it came from a Jewish person, so we shouldn't
Yeah.
trust it,
Mm-hmm.
right? I'll give one more case, um, in which again I, which I think illustrates that it's not something about religion or church systems that repress ideas, but something else. In the US during the Cold War, we have the Red Scare, we have McCarthyism. And there was this physicist, David Bohm, who worked in quantum mechanics. He was a refugee. Ooh, I can't remember now. I'm bad with my history here. He's a refugee
That's
from
okay.
Europe. He had fled to the United States. He was working here. Um, he was an eminent physicist. He was working on this theory of quantum mechanics that we now call Bohmian mechanics. Quantum mechanics is this kind of weird physical theory. Again, as we probably know in quantum mechanics, you can have a particle that's like here and here at the same time, but also nowhere. You can have a particle that's like a wave and a particle and both and
It gets
neither and
weird.
blah, blah, blah.
Yeah,
It's this
it
weird
gets
thing,
weird.
right? So
Yeah.
lots of people, philosophers and physicists, have thought a lot about how should we understand what's going on at the quantum level? Like what's there? What's, as we'd say in philosophy, like what's the metaphysics of the situation? Like what are
Hmm.
things? Are there particles? Are there waves? Is there some other thing we need to think about that can be both at the same time, right? Bohm kind of worked out this way of understanding quantum mechanics where you've got particles and you have waves that always kind of go along together, and the kind of wave kind of pushes along particles. This sketch of the idea. Anyway, he was working on these things. Um, Now, Bohm had certain political commitments to certain forms of socialism, and the issue was that's not okay in McCarthy era United States. And so he gets kind of red listed, and then he gets oh my gosh, word is escaping me. We don't say excommunicated from the US. He gets deported from the US, right? He's forced to move, I think, to Brazil or somewhere in South America. A consequence of this is that Bohm's ideas are already kind of weird and wonky, and they're really new. But he had like a whole group of people that were working on it. Uh, but now it's dangerous to work on these things because they're associated with Bohm, right? And Bohm has been declared by the US a communist or a socialist, right? And so Bohm's research program collapses in the US. But of course, it kind of travels with him where he goes in South America and emerges there. But people don't talk about Bohmian mechanics until very recently in the US, right? And it, it wasn't historically developed as much because of this kind of political situation, right? Now, usually when we think of this case or we think of the Lysenko case, we don't then conclude there is some kind of general relationship between the government and science, whereby we want to say the government represses science, right? Even though we have these cases in which, on the face of it, that is clearly what's happening, right? And yet, when we think about the history of the Catholic Church and science, many people often do want to say something like that. But I think they're entirely the same kind of case, right? All that's happened is that the power structures that be, the things that enforce particular ideologies, right? At one point, it was a church. At one point, it's a secular, somewhat secular government, right? And it's just having that power over what should be thought of as true or what the kinds of things that are socially acceptable to say. That's the thing that suppresses the science. And I think again, this ties back to this like science is the truth kind of thing, right? The powers that be tell us these are the things we can accept as being true. And maybe there's certain areas of inquiry where we don't really care about the truth of that, or like it can be whatever you think it is. But there are certain things that you must think of as true, right? Uh, and the danger is that when we think of science as always being true, as always being associated with true, those institutions that say these are the things that are true and that we must believe are true can draw from that, might sometimes start drawing from that and say, hey, these are the things we know it is true. It is dangerous to not think these things are true. And so you must think they are true. And whenever we start doing that, right, whenever we start thinking science just is this truth, instead of thinking that science is inquiry into the truth, progress towards truth, attempts to figure out the truth, then we're in a dangerous situation because now we're no longer committed to doing science. We're just committed to this abstract truth thing instead of, again, the process of inquiry.
Hmm.
So going back to your thing about, do churches repress science? I don't think that's the right way to think about it. I think historically that's not the case. Of course, we can find isolated incidences of that, but I don't think when we look at the structure of those incidences, that shows that there's anything unique to religion or unique to churches that makes them predisposed to suppressing scientific inquiry. What we do find is that it's their connection to ideology and it's the power they have, the influence they have over kind of the social realm that
Hmm.
enables that kind of repression to occur. But again, there's nothing unique about that to religious institutions. It's just any kind of large social institution.
So be there wouldn't be an objection to scientific theory, but there would be like Newton opposed the Trinity. Like just if it was against their personal beliefs, is that kind of that's kind of what I'm taking away from what you're getting at is that it wasn't that they were bashing the scientific uh, theories they were coming up with, but it was more so if it had to do with something that attacked the church's doctrine in specific. Like you said, that guy was burned at stake, but he didn't believe in divinity or something like that.
Of Christ.
Um,
I think that's what.
Divinity of Christ, yes. Um, okay, wow, that's
Yeah.
interesting because usually it is framed as like this thing where it's like this bad institution. These churches are um, doing this thing. I still feel like I don't know. I need to think about it more. But I think of like Charles Darwin, for example,
Mhm.
and how he was. I think even he was hesitant to publish his theory, um, because I mean, even like the school system, there's been so much talk about should this be taught? Should this? Why are we teaching this, but we're not teaching the Bible? Um,
Right.
and then there was that case in 2005. I'm forgetting what it's called, but they were talking about this. Uh, uh, ID. What is it called? Intellectually
Intelligent design, ID.
intelligent design. Yes,
Yes.
thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, that idea of intelligent design, and that the textbook should say that hey, there's this thing that we don't know, and let's give it this. It just seems like there's this conflict between science and religion constantly, like because like you pointed out, science is viewed as this thing that's objective and superior and like the truth, um, but we shouldn't view it that way, and instead we should view the evidence for whatever the theory is, whether it's religious or scientific, and we should um, sort of go off of that rather than because it's science, it has this validity over everything.
Yeah. And I think, the evolution case is probably the most present in our time of these
Mm-hmm.
like religion science kind of conflicts, right? And this is a place where people say, look, the scientific theory clearly like contradicts what our religion says, and this is a reason to kind of condemn this science or not teach it, or say that it must be taught alongside some other theory as a mere alternative to this other theory. But even then, it it's complicated. So the history of the religious reception of Darwin's is super interesting. So when the Origin first comes out, like Darwin's hesitation in publishing the Origin, well, didn't have religious roots. It was that Darwin knew he was proposing a theory that was going to overthrow, centuries, the whole history of biological work and thinking about uh, species adaptations, right? So you probably learned in high school or in a intro biology class about like Lamarck and kind of that theory of how uh, species can change over time through individual efforts or things like this, right? And Darwin's theory is kind of totally overthrowing that. And it's also relying on a form of geology or a set of geological theories that were also kind of new for the time. So like relying on um, this idea of uniformitarianism, where geological change happens over really, really long time scales. And there were lots of things that kind of weren't quite figured out, like is the Earth actually old enough to accommodate those types of changes? And different people had, different arguments for and against this that we won't get into. But Darwin took a long time to publish the Origin because he wanted to amass tons and tons of evidence. So you could say like here, like I'm not just saying crazy shit. I have really good reasons to believe these things. And when you read the Origin, which I encourage you to do, it's a wonderful read, but it's very long. And it's just like fact after fact after fact. Um, but what's super interesting, I think, about the origin of species is uh, it at the end, he talks about he says there's kind of wonder in this view of life. I can't quote it directly, but it's something like there's wonder in this view of life of evolution by natural selection. And he says, wouldn't it be better if like this is actually how the world works, and that this would indicate that the creator, that God is this supremely intelligent being that could have designed this really complicated system from a set of a couple of rules instead of having special creation for each individual species, right? This what he says. It again, it honors the creator more to have this type of theory. So one, I think it's just super interesting that type of language is there in the Origin of Species itself. But then when we
Yeah,
look at the
it really
immediate
is.
reception of Darwin, the religious reception, no one cares. Nobody has any problems with it, right? Uh, there's this famous American biologist named Asa Gray, who was um, Christian, and he was a huge proponent of Darwin's theory. Okay, but what happened was people thought about the social consequences of Darwin's theory, of this idea that, progress in the biological world, progress towards better forms in the natural world is caused through competition, through natural selection, through, things fighting each other, certain things surviving, other things dying off, right? And there emerged this kind of social program of, it's called social Darwinism, right? Where the thought was, hey, this is if this is how nature works naturally, this is also how humanity should work. And this is how human history does work and how we should think about engineering a better future for humanity, right? And somewhat quickly, people, had objections to this kind of view of humans and kind of how humans should develop in the future. And they said, well, this all traces back to Darwin's theory, right? And so they said the way then to kind of get rid of this unsavory social view is to attack the scientific theory upon which it's based. And so when we look at kind of the arguments against Darwin's theory of natural selection, right, we look at, where they finding um, the problems, right? We ask people today, they're probably going to say something like this, right? They'll probably say, well, look, you just read the book of Genesis, right? The first book of the Bible. And it literally says there that God created the world in 7 days, right? This is the standard argument. And then they say, well, but Darwin says in order to have evolution, you need, millions of years to get this thing going, right? But the Bible clearly says 7 days. Now, you might say, where in the Bible does it say 7 days? And they point to it. It says here, first day, on the second day, on the third day. And then you say, well, what's the Hebrew word for day? And it's yom. And you point out, well, yom actually doesn't just mean a 24-hour day. It can just mean a period of time, right?
Mhm.
And in fact, this is how people the world over had always understood that word. They didn't think about it in terms of a 24-hour day for, thousands of years. And even today, right? Most people, when they read the book of Genesis, don't say, oh, day means 24 hours, right? Now, of course, the reading of it is probably informed by other things, probably by Darwin, in some kind of loose sense. And so we're okay reading that term kind of metaphorically, or we go back to the original Hebrew and we're fine reading it as a long period of time, right? But reading that word day as literal 24 hours is a pretty recent development. That can be traced back to something like 1919 and the publication of this set of volumes called The Fundamentals, which tried to lay out the fundamental doctrines of true Christianity. It was published in the US again in the 1919s. This is where we get the term fundamentalism from. One of the tenets of fundamentalism, at least as expressed in those original volumes, the fundamentals, was we should have a plain reading of the Bible, a plain literal reading of the Bible. And so when you open it and it says day, you should think it means 24-hour day, right? Again, this is totally flies in the face of lots of traditions of biblical interpretation which don't say this. But coming back to the evolution case, right? So we say there's this clear conflict because Bible clearly says 1 day, and evolution can't have that. Or sorry, Bible says 7 days, everything is created, human beings are created. Evolution says we can't have this. But the Bible literally says a lot of other things. Again, you just read the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis says that the world is flat. It says that the sky is filled with water, that we have a flat disk of a world, there is a dome over it. Over the dome is water. We don't believe this, presumably. Most of us don't believe this.
Maybe some
And
people do. I don't.
maybe some people do, right? But most people, even I would think most fundamentalists are open to saying, well, nah, right? That's just a manner of speaking that the Bible uses. It's a poetic usage of language, right? It's not actually supposed to be telling us about the real structure of the universe in this way. In the same exact way as we mentioned earlier, right? In the book of Joshua, Joshua asks God to make the sun stand still, and the sun stands still, right? We don't literally believe that that one could have happened because that would have had insane natural consequences, but we also don't think it really makes sense to say that the sun itself stopped moving, right? Maybe what happened was, it looked as if the sun stopped moving, but really it was the earth that stopped moving or something like this, right? But again, plain literal meaning of the Bible, it seems to say that it's the sun that stopped moving. Now, when we say this, really the thing that we should think about is what the hell do we mean when we say a plain literal meaning of the Bible? Because there's all these places where it doesn't seem like a literal reading of the Bible could make sense. Even just thinking about human creation in the book of Genesis, there are two contradictory instances of the creation of humans. In the first story of the creation of humans, Adam is created first and then Eve is created, and the other they're created at the same time. Right? There's these types of inconsistencies. And if the insistence is that we have this plain literal reading of the Bible, like there's not really a way to deal with this. Okay. Now, backing up to this thing I mentioned before, where I think that the conflict between evolution and this kind of evangelical fundamentalist Christianity isn't really about the content of the scientific theory, it's about the ethics stuff. I think this because why select like these passages as the ones to require a little reading of, right? Why say that day must mean 24-hour period instead of something else? Well, I think it's because they want to object to this particular scientific theory. And they want to object to that particular scientific theory because it has particularly unsavory social consequences, or they think it does. And my little bit of evidence for this is so I went to school down in San Diego, and just outside of San Diego, there's this small town called Santee, and there's this museum there called the Museum for Creation and Earth History. I think that's what it's called. It's a creation science museum. It's a fascinating thing, and if you can visit a creation science museum, I really encourage you to do so. It's a fascinating place. Uh, it's set up chronologically based off of how the universe was created. So you walk through this hall, and there's little plaques that tell you what happened on the different days of creation. We start with the creation of light and have all this stuff about astronomy, creation of the galaxies, and things like this. And then, we have the second and the third day when the different creatures of the earth were created. And so they had, at least at the time, I don't know if they still have them. They had like a little aquarium with like fish. They have like bugs. They have lizards. They have all these different things, right? It's a little biology section. And then you go through and you know, we get the creation of humans. We have the creation of dinosaurs as well. And so they have a nice little exhibit on dinosaurs. And then it goes through kind of a chronology of human culture. Okay, and so you walk through all these exhibits on ancient Egypt, on Rome, on Greece, and then you come to the modern era. This is at the very end. And they have this hall, uh, and they have kind of the good Christian scientists and then the bad atheist scientists. And on the bad side, they have Darwin. And this is kind of at the end. And then right after Darwin, they have this very large kind of plaque. Uh, And the point of the plaque is that Darwinism leads to bad things. It leads to two bad things. One is it leads to abortion. Because if you think that nature is guided by the principle of survival of the fittest, survival of the strongest, then of course you're going to be open to aborting the weaker looking fetuses. The second thing it leads to is the Holocaust. This is how the exhibit ends. Darwinism leads to abortion and it leads to the Holocaust. And they cite from Hitler, who explicitly in Mein Kampf refers to the origin of species, refers to Darwin's idea of natural selection as justification. for doing this. What Hitler is trying to do is he's trying to purify the human race. And the way you do that is by cutting out the weaker parts. Right? And of course, Hitler thought, well, the Jews and all these other minority groups were the weaker parts, right? He's trying to create the ideal Aryan race. And so the setup of this museum, what it shows to me is the real concern is that it's these social things, right? This the science is in some sense secondary, right? And so opposition to evolution isn't really opposition to the science itself. It's opposition to the conclusions people are going to draw based off of the science. And so this is all a very long roundabout way of saying that something that on the surface looks like just immediate opposition between the claims of some science and the claims of some religion, it's not that straightforward, right? There's lots of claims made by many religions and lots of claims made by many sciences. And if we look at any two propositions, it's probably easy for us to find ways in which they're incompatible. Or sorry, I should say, if we're just looking at those different bodies, we can always pick out different propositions that are going to be incompatible with each other. But we don't pick out all of those possible pairs, right? Certain pairs are chosen. And it's important for us to think about why those pairs are chosen. And when we do that, I think what we find is that the apparent conflict between religion and science isn't because there's incompatibility between these propositions, but there's incompatibility because we don't like the consequences or the possible interpretations of whatever the scientific ideas are, or maybe even whatever the religious ideas
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I'm learning so much. This is so cool.
are.
I'm loving this.
Sorry, I know we've gone very far from
I'm loving this. Are we
we
doing okay on
started.
time, by the way? I know we're like 30 minutes over. Is that
I'm
okay?
fine. Yeah, I'm
Okay.
fine however long you want to.
Oh,
Um,
cool. Thank you.
yeah.
Yeah, I can't wait to like listen back to this and really, I mean, so much of it is stuff I just need to like absorb and just like think through. Like, there's so many things like, whoa, 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 like just coming at me. I love it so much. Um, I think I really like something that you mentioned near the end there, and it's more of a thing that has to do with ethics and spirituality, which is this idea that if you do like what Hitler believed is that, oh, like this race is the superior race and this race is Jewish people should be exterminated, and he kind of like was able to somehow step out of like his humanism and like be desensitized to the Jewish race over a scientific theory. Um, so I think that right there is a good example of why I guess the importance of spirituality, not necessarily religion, but having a grounded way in just understanding that these are all just ideas and that shouldn't overflow into ethics, and that shouldn't make you think that um, this particular race is inferior to all the other ones because Darwin said this and because I feel this way. I think that's like super dangerous. And wow, I did not know that. That's insane. Um, but yeah, gosh, I think a lot. I think one that notion of keeping spirituality or that connectedness to humanity in whatever it is you do and not taking our theories too far, I think is really important. Like remembering that we're all human beings and that, I mean, we could say that we're all just atoms and molecules and cells and think of it that way and be like, we don't really matter and whatever. Like you can have a like nihilistic view um and go down that path, but I think that's why it's important to be able to have balance with these things and not take them in the way Hitler did, which is like really a great example for just how awful things can get if you just look at it from an objective lens and just take.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's really scary. Um,
Yeah. I don't know if um I would say we don't or we have to kind of moderate the objective lens or something like that.
I don't think so either.
Um,
Yeah, I'm not saying that
um
either. I
I
think what
think
I'm saying. Yeah, what were you gonna say?
I was just gonna say I think this again ties back to one of these dangers of equating science with the truth, right? Hitler was convinced that he was operating
Wasn't
on
Hitler also Christian?
um I think I'll say I don't know enough about this
Okay.
particular case
I've
for
heard
me
that.
to
I
feel
don't know either.
comfortable.
I don't know either.
But I also think you can be Christian in many ways. Is always one thing I should say. Um,
Yes.
what I had wanted to say was uh, the Nazi program was based off of what they considered to be some of the best science of their day. Right? The eugenics program of trying to create the best human race was heavily grounded in science. It was thought to be kind of the pinnacle of good science. You just Google eugenics, you can find these images of like this tree that shows like eugenics is the you know uh, this kind of product of all these different sciences. You have biometrics, you have sociology, anthropology. All these things are roots that lead into this really good thing of eugenics. And eugenics is good because it's going to make humans better, right? And of course, we all want to have better humans. Um, and so, eugenicists were convinced they were doing all this great science, right? Eugenics was huge in the US. We had these like family beauty pageants, these like eugenics competitions where you would bring your family to like the fair and it's like a family beauty pageant and you see like who has the best genes. And then the idea is, oh, we should like breed these people with other people with really good genes, right? You find out the families you should marry into to have the best children. Actually, I think we had talked about this before, and maybe we didn't talk about this in our class, but talked about it in a different class. The Nazi eugenics program was explicitly modeled off of a eugenics program that got its start in California, in Pasadena, right? There were these letters of praise back and forth between California scientists and German scientists about the eugenics programs they were running. But in any case, eugenics was seen as like the good thing, the science. Again, we made this equivocation between science and the truth, and that was dangerous, right? Because we forgot that science is not the truth. It is our progress of figuring out what the truth is. Now, of course, we always have to act on the best knowledge that we have. So we should do things that are informed by the science. But we should always be careful, I think. I think the lesson to draw from something like the history of eugenics is we have to be careful that when we're going to have policies that are going to have these wide-ranging social impacts, we have to be really careful about the science and make sure our science really is well-founded, that the foundations for our work are really sturdy, that we've done our due diligence in making sure we've eliminated all the types of biases that we possibly could, right? Now, before we move on to making these huge types of social programs. And so again, everything gets tied back to this thing you started with of truth
Mhm.
and science. And we just always have to be aware of when we're making that equivocation.
Yeah, absolutely. It also makes me think of the Jennifer Doudna discovery of CRISPR-Cas9, where we can go in and genetically modify human beings, and how that was like, how that's been like a huge thing because that's more of a recent discovery, and how that's been in a
Mhm.
lot of bioethical conversations, and how there was this doctor in, oh gosh, I think it was China maybe. He he did some manipulative stuff that he shouldn't have done to twins that were being born, and they were pre-susceptible to having AIDS, and he was
Mm.
able to rid their body of AIDS using that technique. And I mean, he cured the babies, but still he went to jail for I think 3 4 years after that because it was still unethical that he used
Mhm.
that technology in that way. Um, that's something that also is in the topic of this discussion.
Yeah, yeah, right. We can use science to do great, really powerful things, but we want to be calm about it, and we want to make sure we are aware of the consequences of where these things are going to go. Of course,
Yeah.
I don't think the solution should be like, CRISPR, we should like never use it full stop, or that somehow the like science that led up to CRISPR should, I don't know, be burned or something like that. It's just we should be aware of the application, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in the same way that we have laws restricting how we use other tools, right? I can't use a chainsaw. I don't know, like, I don't know, in my classroom on people or something like this, right? I can't use guns in all states. I can't use guns to, shoot innocent people, right? Um, there's laws that constrain the things that we can do, but that doesn't mean like we shouldn't, you know, we can have different thoughts about gun control, right? You might not think it means that there shouldn't be any guns or that we should, burn the capacity to create guns and things like that.
Yeah. This idea of truth, I feel like if you ponder in it for too long and you really try to grasp this objective truth and understanding, I feel like it could drive you crazy a little bit. And this leads to like an anecdote I wanted to share with you and our viewers as well. There was a moment in our class where you shared this Hume quote, and it was on how the induction problem was like driving him insane, and he basically just talked about how it was driving him into delirium and melancholy, and then he would step away from that problem and he'd go back into the real world and he would talk to his friends and play backgammon and touch grass essentially. And it was so beautiful. He was just like, and I go back and I realized that what really matters is just, the things that we usually consider trivial, or just like hanging out with friends and just being a human being and not thinking so deeply and analytically about things all the time. That was really important for me to hear at that time, because I was
Mm,
in this place for over a year, just so obsessed with like truth, and like really just like losing what makes me human and losing the those parts of myself that were so crucial and that make life. I feel like it's so easy to get stuck in abstract thought and taking something so literally, um, and just kind of losing yourself in that way, not having balance. Um, that was like, and this is going to sound dramatic, but I'm not even joking, probably one of the most profound quotes in philosophy I'll ever read, because it just came at a
mm,
time that I needed so bad, just to like ground myself and to just be like, it's so fun to do this stuff and to like engage with looking for truth and doing science and all this fun stuff. But at the same time, you're a human being, and don't forget that. It's like, it's
right.
almost like it's almost like Hitler forgot that, or some people take this stuff too literally and it drives them insane, and they're too busy in the abstract. It's like Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. You have this character who loses himself in abstract thought and convinces himself murdering is okay. And there's just thank God I never I never went to any places like that, but it was just
Right.
it was lonely sometimes, just thinking about stuff in such a deep way, and it didn't feel grounded. And so that quote in particular, it was near the end of the semester, had such a big impact on me, and I just wanted to share that with you.
I'm so glad to hear that. And I know you worked through some very dark things, and um I'm sure he would be happy. That, yeah.
um, one more question before we wrap this up, and I just
Yeah.
wanted, Professor Chin, this has been so awesome. Like, you have no idea like how cool this is to get to talk to you about this stuff, and
No, this
all
is
the stuff you're sharing is like so awesome. Like, I can't wait to go back and just like think about things and just like ponder about them and talk them with my friends. Like, I'm so excited. Um, the last question I have, and it's a big one, is what do you make of all of this? Like, life, the universe, existence, just all of this stuff. You study the methods for, I mean, why we think about the things we think about, and you're curious for understanding the way that the world works. And what do you make of all this personally? Like, how do you feel about the universe and life and existence?
so I feel bad because I feel like I'm gonna have a disappointing answer here.
Please.
Which is that I guess maybe I don't make much of it. I think today there's this I think it's popular for people to identify as spiritual but not religious. And I think what they mean by that is something like, well, there's this they feel like there's something in the world. And they feel like there's kind of this deep meaning. Um, but they don't want to identify that as being religious for a variety of historical reasons. But I think one of the things they want to get at is like they're uncomfortable with this idea of like institutional religion, of there being this like structure that they like fit into that has, a certain set of beliefs and a certain set of prescribed actions or ceremonies, right? They feel like there's something, right? And this is, we poll people, you look at all these really interesting religious or statistics about religion in the US or in the 21st century world. And there's this growing category of nuns, people that don't have a particular religious affiliation, but many of those people still believe that there is God or that there's something out there, right? There's a higher power. Um, for me, I think I wouldn't identify as spiritual but not religious. If anything, I would identify as religious but not spiritual or something like this. In the sense that I don't feel kind of an inner sense of purpose, or I don't feel like there's um, I don't feel that there's a higher power or something like that. Um, but I feel that there's a lot of meaning from institutions, from connections with other people and kind of formalized traditions. Um, or when I celebrate Christmas with my family, or we're all atheists, or I don't know, my parents maybe might have some kind of form of spirituality, but uh, we didn't grow up Christian. We didn't grow up going to churches or temple or anything like that. But there's something I think deeply meaningful that, when I think about it, when I think about being with my family at those points in time for birthdays or things like that, it like, you feel it. I like get brought to tears, right? I have those kinds of things. I was recently at the Grand Canyon um, with my wife, and many people, right, have these kind of maybe they describe them in spiritual or religious terms, these experiences when they're in nature. Maybe you've had these kinds of things too. But I experienced things like that, right? I was looking at, you can see uh, the lines of stratigraphy that like show, you can count them up and you can date the Grand Canyon. And just thinking about how old it is and how vast in terms of time the world is, and the thing how vast, the universe is, you know, that got me feeling something. But I wouldn't say it's that there's a higher power. What it brought me to was, wow, like we're here and we can experience that and we can see that. And there was all this stuff that happened that had to happen in some sense for us to have this experience. And for me, it was also thinking that, wow, like I can have this experience, I can see these things, and other people can do it too, and other people have for thousands of years, right? They've seen these same types of things, and maybe they thought these same types of things. That's where I find the meaning, right? I cried when I went to Disneyland and I saw the fireworks, right? Because I think to myself, wow, like what if everybody saw this? Like, isn't this what everybody wants for themselves and for their children? For people to just like gather together and like look at pretty lights in the sky. So that's not thinking about all there is per se, right? Um, but I like to think in some sense smaller. And yeah, the world is a meaningless place, right? We're just little blips in the history of the universe. We're just collections of stuff, whatever it is. Um, but I also don't feel like why should there be meaning in that? I don't see a reason for that. I think even if, the universe don't got meaning in that way, why should that matter? We can create our own meaning. We can find it. So, disappointing answer. Sorry.
No, that was beautifully poetic. It's almost gonna put me in tears. I enjoyed every second of that. That was lovely. Yeah, that was that was so incredible. Wow, I feel like that needs to be like put on like in a museum or something. That was lovely. Professor Chin, thank you so much for doing this.
Well,
Thank
of
you.
course.
Thank you to everyone who tuned in and listened to this really interesting conversation. Um, this was really fun. I had such a great time. I cannot wait to listen back and just explore a lot of these ideas a lot more. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
thank you
thank
so much
you.
for having me. This is a lot of fun for me too. And again, I'm so flattered that you reached out and that you shared your experience. I'm deeply honored and so happy that um, I've had some type of influence.
A big
Yeah,
influence. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank
yeah.
you. And goodbye, everyone. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.